The emergency room fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across my son's designer sneakers as he paced the waiting area, his Rolex catching the light with each agitated gesture. I sat quietly in the uncomfortable plastic chair, watching Marcus calculate how much this medical crisis was going to cost him, never once considering that his 63-year-old mother might have the means to help. When the doctor emerged with the devastating news that his daughter Sophia would need immediate surgery and months of specialized treatment that his insurance wouldn't fully cover, Marcus turned to me with barely concealed disdain and said the words that would change everything between us forever. "Mom, I know you're too broke to help, so don't even offer. It's embarrassing enough having to explain to the medical staff why my kid's grandmother drives a 15-year-old Honda and shops at discount stores." The contempt in his voice wasn't new, but its timing, while his 7-year-old daughter lay frightened in a hospital bed, revealed exactly how far my son had drifted from the values I'd tried to instill in him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I remained silent as Marcus continued his financial calculations aloud, dismissing my presence as irrelevant to any solution. What he didn't know, what I had carefully hidden for the past 8 years, was that his assumption about my financial situation couldn't have been more wrong. The threadbare cardigan I wore and the sensible flats I'd owned for 5 years told one story, but the investment portfolio I checked monthly on my laptop told an entirely different one. $800,000, accumulated through decades of careful saving, strategic investing, and a life insurance payout from my late husband Howard that I'd never mentioned to anyone. I had learned long ago that money revealed people's true character, and I wanted my children to love me for who I was, not what I could give them. But sitting in that sterile waiting room, listening to my son dismiss me as a financial burden while his daughter needed help, I realized my test of character had revealed more than I'd ever wanted to know. Marcus had always been ambitious, even as a child. While his younger sister Elena spent afternoons helping me in the garden or volunteering at the local food bank, Marcus had been focused on achievement and acquisition. Honor roll, varsity tennis, president of the investment club. Howard and I had been proud of his drive, mistaking ambition for character, assuming that success would naturally breed generosity. We paid for his university education at Northwestern, celebrated when he landed his first job at a prestigious consulting firm, and stood beaming at his wedding to Victoria, a fellow MBA graduate who shared his taste for luxury brands and social climbing. Somewhere along the way, though, Marcus had begun to view Howard and me not as the parents who had sacrificed for his success, but as embarrassing reminders of his middle-class origins. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. Family dinners became less frequent, replaced by apologetic text messages about client dinners and networking events. When Howard was diagnosed with cancer, Marcus visited the minimum amount necessary to avoid criticism from family friends, always checking his phone, always needing to leave early for important meetings. Victoria rarely accompanied him, claiming their twin boys, Preston and Parker, had too many scheduled activities to miss. Elena, living 3 states away with her teacher's salary, somehow managed to visit every weekend, taking unpaid leave to be there for Howard's final weeks. After Howard's death, Marcus had arrived at the funeral in his Tesla, spent the service networking with distant relatives about investment opportunities, and left immediately after the reception, citing an early morning presentation. That was when I made my decision about the money. Howard's life insurance, combined with our savings and investments, had left me financially secure beyond anything Marcus would imagine. But watching my son treat his father's funeral as a networking opportunity while Elena held my hand through the grief, I knew that revealing my wealth would only attract Marcus's attention for all the wrong reasons. So I downsized to a modest 2-bedroom condo, kept my old Honda despite being able to afford any car I wanted, and continued shopping sales while my investment portfolio quietly grew. I wanted to see who my children really were when they thought I had nothing to offer but my love and presence. Elena never disappointed me. Despite struggling with student loans and living paycheck to paycheck as a special education teacher, she called weekly, visited when she could afford the gas, and never once complained about her circumstances. She'd invite me to stay with her in her tiny apartment, cooking elaborate meals on her hot plate, treating me like royalty despite having so little. When her ancient laptop died, preventing her from completing her master's degree coursework, she took on tutoring jobs rather than ask for help. I had quietly arranged for her to win a technology grant from an anonymous donor, watching her joy at receiving a new computer without any idea it came from me. She sent handwritten thank you notes to the foundation I'd created, never knowing her mother was reading them. Marcus, meanwhile, had built his success into a fortress of superiority. His home in Westchester showcased his achievements with the subtlety of a museum exhibit. Harvard degrees framed in gold, photos from charity galas where he and Victoria smiled beside minor celebrities, and children's accomplishments displayed like trophies. Preston and Parker attended Blackstone Preparatory Academy, their schedules packed with Mandarin lessons, lacrosse practice, and violin recitals designed to guarantee Ivy League admissions. Sophia had arrived unexpectedly 5 years after the twins, what Marcus privately referred to as their little surprise in a tone that suggested inconvenience rather than joy. Unlike her brothers, who had inherited their parents' sharp features and sharper ambition, Sophia was soft and dreamy, preferring books to tennis lessons, choosing to spend recitals watching clouds through the window rather than performing. I had bonded with Sophia in a way that seemed to perplex Marcus and Victoria. While they struggled to understand their daughter's gentle nature and inability to compete, I recognized a kindred spirit. During my infrequent but cherished visits, Sophia would slip away from her scheduled activities to sit with me, asking questions about the flowers in my garden photos or begging for stories about her grandfather Howard. She had his eyes, warm and curious, seeing wonder where others saw only opportunity. Victoria found our connection baffling and slightly threatening, often interrupting our conversations to remind Sophia about practice or homework. Marcus simply ignored it, confident that private school and proper guidance would eventually mold his daughter into something more acceptable. The call about Sophia's accident had come on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing quarterly statements from my financial advisor. Marcus's voice had been uncharacteristically shaken as he explained that Sophia had fallen during a school field trip, suffering a traumatic brain injury that required immediate intervention. I had dropped everything, driving 3 hours to reach the hospital, finding my son for once without his usual armor of superiority. But that vulnerability lasted only until finances entered the equation. As the medical team outlined the extensive treatment plan, I watched Marcus's expression shift from concerned father to calculating businessman, mentally tallying costs and examining every possible angle except the one where his supposedly impoverished mother might help. Dr. Patel, the neurosurgeon, had been exceptionally patient as she explained the situation. The surgery itself would be partially covered by insurance, but the specialized rehabilitation program that offered Sophia the best chance of full recovery was considered experimental. 6 months of intensive therapy at the Grayson Neurological Institute, one of only 3 facilities in the country equipped for this specific treatment. The cost was staggering, nearly $300,000 beyond what insurance would cover. I watched Marcus's face drain of color as the number registered, his mental calculations visible as he processed what this meant for his carefully constructed lifestyle. Victoria, who had finally arrived from her partner's meeting at the law firm, immediately began questioning the necessity of the specialized program, wondering aloud if standard rehabilitation might be sufficient. As they discussed finances in front of the doctor, treating Sophia's future like a corporate negotiation, I felt something shift inside me. 8 years of watching Marcus prioritize wealth over relationships, success over family, had been painful but tolerable when it only affected me. But seeing him weigh his daughter's recovery against his portfolio performance was more than I could silently endure. When Dr. Patel stepped out to give them time to discuss, I made a decision that would unravel the carefully maintained fiction of my poverty. Marcus turned to Victoria with the expression of a man calculating liquidation options. We could take a second mortgage, but the market timing is terrible. Maybe sell the Tesla, though depreciation has already hit hard. Your parents? Victoria laughed bitterly at the suggestion. They're still recovering from the renovation of their Southampton house. Besides, they already think we overextended ourselves buying in Westchester. Then, as if remembering I was in the room, Marcus glanced at me with that mixture of pity and embarrassment I'd grown accustomed to seeing. Mom, I know this is hard to watch. Maybe you should go home. There's nothing you can do here anyway. The dismissal stung more than his earlier comment about my supposed poverty. Here was my granddaughter facing months of uncertainty, and my son thought my only contribution would be to remove my embarrassing presence. I stood slowly, my joints protesting after hours in the uncomfortable chair, and Marcus likely interpreted my struggle as another sign of my irrelevance. But instead of leaving, I walked to the window overlooking the hospital parking lot where my old Honda sat between Mercedes and BMWs, a deliberate choice that had once seemed wise but now felt like a cruel joke. "Marcus," I said quietly, still facing the window, "what would you do if I could help?" The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Marcus actually laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the antiseptic hospital air. "Mom, please. I know you want to help, but selling your car might get us $1,000 if we're lucky. And I'm not taking your Social Security money. It's sweet that you want to contribute, but this is beyond anything you could imagine." Victoria nodded in agreement, already returning to her phone to research standard rehabilitation facilities that might be more affordable. I turned from the window to face my son fully, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since Howard's death. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The successful consultant with his tailored suit and leather briefcase was just a frightened man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling, but instead of reaching for family, he was pushing away anyone he deemed unworthy of his crisis. The irony that he judged worth purely in monetary terms while sitting in a hospital where his daughter's life hung in the balance was apparently lost on him. I reached into my purse, the worn leather bag that Victoria had once offered to replace with something less embarrassing, and pulled out my phone. "Let me make a call," I said, moving toward the door. Marcus waved dismissively, assuming I was going to beg Elena for money she didn't have or perhaps call my church friends for prayers. I stepped into the corridor and dialed my financial advisor, Richard Steinberg, who answered on the second ring with his usual warmth. Richard had been managing my portfolio since Howard's death, helping me grow the life insurance and savings into a substantial nest egg through careful investment and compound interest. He was one of only 3 people who knew the truth about my financial situation, the others being my attorney and my accountant. Margaret, Richard's voice was professional but friendly, having guided me through 8 years of financial planning. "What can I do for you today?" I explained the situation briefly, asking about the liquidity of certain investments and the tax implications of a large withdrawal. Richard, ever efficient, ran the numbers quickly. "You could easily cover $300,000 without even touching your primary investment accounts," he assured me. "The emergency fund alone could handle it, though I'd recommend structuring it properly for tax purposes." We talked through the details, and within 15 minutes, I had a plan that would not only cover Sophia's treatment but also establish a medical trust for any future needs. When I returned to the waiting room, Marcus was on his laptop, frantically moving numbers around in a spreadsheet while Victoria spoke tensely on the phone with her parents. Neither looked up as I entered, too absorbed in their desperate calculations to notice I carried myself differently, with the quiet confidence of someone who had just solved their most pressing problem. I sat back in the uncomfortable chair and waited, watching my son's growing panic as each potential solution proved inadequate. Finally, as the sunset painted orange streaks across the sterile walls, Dr. Patel returned with admission paperwork for Sophia's surgery. "She needs a decision soon," the doctor said gently but firmly. "The surgical team is ready, but we need to confirm the rehabilitation program placement tonight to secure her spot. They only have 2 beds available, and there's another family waiting." Marcus's hands shook as he held the forms. "We need more time. Can we have until morning? I'm waiting for some calls about loans." Dr. Patel's expression was sympathetic but unyielding. "I can give you 2 more hours, but that's all. These specialized programs have waiting lists months long. This opening is only available because of a cancellation." The weight of the moment pressed down on the room as the doctor left again. Victoria had started crying, her composed exterior finally cracking as she faced the possibility that their daughter might not receive the best treatment simply because they couldn't liquidate assets fast enough. Despite everything, watching their pain stirred my maternal instincts. These were still my family, even if they had forgotten what that meant. "I'll cover it," I said quietly, my words dropping into their panic like stones into still water. Both Marcus and Victoria looked at me with identical expressions of confusion, as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. The full amount. The surgery, the rehabilitation, all of it. Marcus's laptop nearly slid off his knees as he stared at me. "Mom, this isn't a joke. We're talking about $300,000. You don't have that kind of money. You live in a 2-bedroom condo and buy generic groceries. I pulled out my phone again, this time opening the banking app one rarely used in front of anyone. The account balance appeared on the screen, clear and undeniable. $800,000 in liquid assets, not counting the investment properties or the retirement accounts. I turned the screen toward my son, watching his expression shift from disbelief to shock to something I couldn't quite identify. Perhaps shame, though I doubted Marcus had enough self-awareness for that emotion. Victoria grabbed the phone from my hand, staring at the numbers as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense in her worldview. How? Was all she managed to say. Howard's life insurance and 40 years of careful saving and investing, I replied simply. I've lived below my means by choice, not necessity. Watching people's character reveal itself when they think you have nothing to offer has been incredibly educational. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine before landing on anger, his default when faced with uncomfortable truths. You've been lying to us for 8 years? His voice rose, drawing concerned looks from passing nurses. Letting us think you were some poor widow living on Social Security while you sat on nearly $1 million? I never lied, I responded calmly. You assumed. Every time you made comments about my old car or modest clothes, every time you dismissed me as financially irrelevant, you were telling me exactly who you are. I wanted to know if my children would love me without money. Elena does. You, Marcus, apparently don't. The truth hung between us like a physical presence. Victoria had the grace to look ashamed, but Marcus's anger only intensified. So this was all some kind of test. While we stressed about private school tuition and mortgage payments, you were secretly wealthy, judging us? Not judging, I corrected. Observing. Watching you choose networking over your father's funeral. Listening to you apologize for my appearance to your colleagues. Seeing you treat family relationships like business transactions. The money was never hidden out of cruelty, Marcus. It was protected from your greed. Before he could respond, I stood and walked to the nurse's station, requesting to speak with Dr. Patel about payment arrangements. The conversation was brief and professional. Yes, I could provide a certified check by morning. Yes, I understood the treatment protocol and timeline. Yes, I was prepared to cover all associated costs. When I returned, Marcus and Victoria were whispering furiously, their body language tense with barely contained emotion. As I approached, Victoria stood abruptly, gathering her designer purse with sharp movements. I need to check on Sophia, she announced, though her avoidance of eye contact suggested she simply needed to escape the uncomfortable revelation of their misjudgment. Marcus remained seated, his expression now calculating in a different way. I could see him reassessing every interaction from the past 8 years, recalibrating his understanding of power dynamics that had just shifted dramatically. The son who had dismissed his mother as a burden was now facing the reality that she had more liquid assets than he did, despite all his success and striving. Mom, he began, his tone notably softer, I understand you're upset about how things have been. But Sophia needs this treatment. She's your granddaughter. Surely whatever issues we have can wait until after she's recovered. The manipulation was almost impressive in its transparency. Having discovered my wealth, Marcus was attempting to leverage Sophia's medical crisis to avoid confronting his behavior. It was exactly the response I had feared when Howard first died, the reason I had hidden the money in the first place. But I was older now, wiser, and far less willing to enable my son's worst impulses. Sophia will receive the best treatment available, I assured him. I've already committed to covering all costs. But that doesn't erase 8 years of dismissive treatment, Marcus. This isn't about the money. It's about the fact that you only see my value now that you know I have it. That's not true, he protested weakly, but even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. We both knew that if I had revealed my poverty was genuine, he would have been irritated by my useless presence rather than grateful for my emotional support. The next several hours passed in a blur of medical forms and financial arrangements. Richard had worked his usual magic, ensuring funds would be available immediately while minimizing tax implications. Elena, whom I had called with a carefully edited version of events, was already booking a flight to be there for Sophia's surgery. She had cried when I told her I could cover the medical costs, not from relief but from fear for her niece. The difference between my children's reactions told me everything I had already known but hoped wasn't true. As midnight approached and Sophia was being prepped for morning surgery, I found myself alone with her in the pediatric ward. She looked so small in the hospital bed, her usually bright eyes dulled by medication and trauma. But when she saw me, a weak smile crossed her face. "Grandma," she whispered, "am I going to be okay?" I smoothed her hair gently, feeling the weight of responsibility for this precious child who deserved so much better than parents who calculated her worth in dollars. "You're going to be just fine, sweetheart. You're getting the very best care, and Aunt Elena will be here tomorrow too." Sophia's smile widened slightly at mention of Elena. "She tells the best stories," she murmured. "Mom and Dad don't like stories. They like facts and figures." Out of the mouths of babes, though Sophia was simply stating what she had observed. Her parents didn't like stories because stories required emotion, imagination, and the ability to see beyond spreadsheets and social climbing. I stayed with her until she fell asleep, holding her small hand and promising silently that whatever happened between Marcus and me, I would ensure she never paid the price for her parents' choices. Victoria returned near dawn, looking haggard despite her carefully maintained appearance. She found me in the family lounge, writing in the journal I'd kept since Howard's death. "Margaret," she began formally, then seemed to reconsider. "Mom," she tried again, the word unfamiliar on her tongue after years of careful distance. "I need to understand something. The money, why hide it? Why let us struggle?" I closed my journal deliberately, choosing my words carefully. "Victoria, you and Marcus never struggled. You chose to live beyond your means, prioritizing appearance over security. The private schools, the country club memberships, the luxury cars, those were choices, not necessities. I lived within my means and found contentment. You both viewed that as failure rather than wisdom." She shifted uncomfortably but didn't deny my assessment. Her honesty, however brutal, was more than Marcus had managed. "We thought we were building something important," she said finally. "Success that would benefit everyone eventually. Including you and Howard." "Did you?" I asked gently. Because from where I sat, it seemed like you were building walls. Every achievement created more distance. Every success became another reason to be embarrassed by your middle-class origins. Howard died thinking his son was too important to spend time with him. That's not success, Victoria. That's tragedy. The conversation was interrupted by Elena's arrival, still wearing the paint-stained jeans she'd had on when I called. She had driven through the night after her flight was cancelled, stopping only for gas and coffee. The contrast between her appearance and Victoria's designer outfit was stark, but Elena's immediate focus was Sophia, not status. She hugged me tightly, whispering thank you for being able to help before heading straight to Sophia's room. Victoria watched her go with an expression I couldn't quite read, perhaps finally understanding that Elena's paint-stained jeans represented priorities she and Marcus had never possessed. The surgery was scheduled for 7 that morning. As the surgical team prepared, our small family gathered in various states of dysfunction. Marcus had arrived looking professionally composed but emotionally rattled, having spent the night researching my financial holdings through public records and reaching conclusions that clearly disturbed him. Elena sat beside Sophia's bed, telling her stories about brave princesses and magical forests, providing the comfort that imagination offers when facts become too frightening. Victoria stood apart, making work calls despite the early hour, perhaps finding refuge in professional obligations from personal revelations. I watched them all from my position by the window, seeing my family clearly in the harsh morning light. Elena, paid the least but worth the most, offering love without calculation. Victoria, trapped between ambition and awakening conscience, beginning to question the priorities that had seemed so certain. And Marcus, my son, facing the humbling reality that success as he defined it had made him a stranger to his own mother and a footnote in his daughter's affections. The money had indeed revealed character, just not in the way any of them had expected. As they wheeled Sophia towards surgery, she reached for my hand rather than her parents', a small gesture that spoke volumes. I squeezed gently, promising to be there when she woke up. Marcus watched this interaction with something like recognition, perhaps finally understanding that relationships couldn't be accumulated like assets or displayed like trophies. They had to be earned through presence, patience, and the kind of love that didn't calculate return on investment. The surgery took 6 hours. We sat in different corners of the waiting room like islands in an archipelago of awkwardness. Elena graded papers to keep busy, occasionally sharing amusing student responses that lightened the oppressive atmosphere. Victoria worked on her laptop, but I noticed she spent more time staring at the screen than typing. Marcus sat rigidly, checking his phone every few minutes for updates from work that seemed increasingly irrelevant. I worked on a crossword puzzle, finding comfort in problems that had definitive solutions. Around hour 4, Marcus approached my corner, sitting in the adjacent chair with obvious discomfort. "The money Dad left," he began, then stopped, reconsidering. "Did he know you were going to hide it?" "Howard knew I would use it wisely," I replied, not looking up from my puzzle. "He trusted me to make decisions that protected our family's values, not just our assets. Sometimes that meant keeping secrets from people who would misunderstand or misuse the information." "You mean me," Marcus said flatly. "You and Dad both thought I'd misuse it." I set down my pencil, finally meeting his gaze. "Marcus, you've spent 8 years proving we were right to be cautious. Every interaction became transactional once you achieved success. Every family gathering was evaluated for its networking potential. Can you honestly say that knowing about the money wouldn't have changed how you treated me?" He wanted to argue, I could see it in his expression, but the truth was too obvious to deny. When Dr. Patel finally emerged with news that the surgery had been successful, the relief was palpable. Sophia would need careful monitoring and months of rehabilitation, but the prognosis was excellent. As we absorbed this information, Marcus did something unexpected. He thanked me, not just for the money but for being there, for caring about Sophia when he'd been too panicked to offer comfort. It was a small gesture, possibly calculated, but I chose to accept it as genuine. People could change, Howard always believed that, and perhaps Sophia's crisis would be the catalyst Marcus needed. The Grayson Institute was a marvel of modern medicine, looking more like a resort than a rehabilitation facility. Sophia's room overlooked gardens designed specifically for neurological recovery, with paths that stimulated different cognitive functions. The staff was exceptional, combining cutting-edge treatment with genuine warmth. As I signed the financial papers, committing to 6 months of intensive therapy, I felt Howard's presence strongly. This was what money was for, not accumulation or display, but the ability to help when help was desperately needed. Over the following weeks, a new routine emerged. I visited Sophia daily, bringing books and puzzles, sitting with her through difficult therapy sessions. Elena came every weekend, using her experience with special needs children to support Sophia's cognitive exercises. Victoria reduced her hours at the firm, something I never thought I'd witness, spending afternoons at the institute. And Marcus, perhaps most surprisingly, began showing up not with spreadsheets or phone calls, but with time and attention, reading to Sophia when she was too tired to hold books herself. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Marcus still checked his phone too often, still calculated costs and benefits reflexively. But I caught moments of genuine engagement, especially when Sophia struggled with memory exercises and he patiently worked through them with her, his success-oriented drive redirected toward her recovery. Victoria and I developed an unexpected rapport during long waiting room conversations, discovering common ground in our concerns for Sophia and our frustrations with the medical system's bureaucracy. 3 months into treatment, Sophia had made remarkable progress, exceeding all medical expectations. Her memory had largely returned, her motor skills were improving daily, and her spirit remained undaunted. During a particularly successful therapy session, she looked at the family gathered around her, Marcus, Victoria, Elena, and me, and said with her characteristic directness, "We're all here together." It took me getting hurt for everyone to be in the same room without arguing. The uncomfortable truth of her observation silenced us all momentarily. Then Elena laughed, breaking the tension. "Out of the mouths of babes," she said, echoing my earlier thought. Though technically, Sophia, you're getting a bit old for that excuse. The conversation that followed was the most honest our family had shared in years. Victoria admitted to feeling overwhelmed by the pressure to succeed. Elena confessed to resentment about being overlooked because she chose service over salary. Marcus, with visible difficulty, acknowledged that he had prioritized achievement over relationships, measuring worth in ways that missed what truly mattered. "And you, Mom?" Marcus asked, turning to me with genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "What's your confession in this family therapy session?" I considered carefully before responding. "I confused teaching with testing. I wanted you both to learn that money doesn't determine worth, but instead of teaching that lesson openly, I turned it into a secret test. That wasn't fair to any of you. The admission cost me something, but it also lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying." As Sophia continued her recovery, the family dynamics slowly shifted. Marcus began calling regularly, not about money but about memories, asking about Howard's values and my perspectives on success. He was reconsidering his own priorities, especially after Sophia mentioned she barely knew her brothers because they were always at activities designed to look good on college applications. Victoria started volunteering at the Institute's family support group, using her legal expertise to help other families navigate insurance battles. Her designer suits gave way to comfortable clothes better suited for sitting on therapy mats and playing cognitive games. Elena, freed from the burden of being the only good child, began sharing her own struggles more openly. The grant for her laptop, she admitted one day with a knowing smile, had seemed too fortunate to be coincidental. I neither confirmed nor denied her suspicion, but we both understood that some gifts were best given anonymously, preserving dignity while providing help. She was pursuing her doctorate now, funded by another mysterious scholarship that would allow her to develop special education programs for children with neurological challenges. 5 months into treatment, as Sophia prepared for her final weeks at the Institute, Marcus asked to meet privately. We sat in the facility's garden, watching patients navigate the therapeutic pathways that promoted healing through movement and beauty. "Mom," he began, then paused, gathering thoughts that seemed difficult to articulate. "I've been thinking about success differently lately. Watching Sophia fight to relearn basic tasks, seeing Elena's patience, your quiet strength, even Victoria's growth, I realize I've been measuring wrong my whole life." I waited, understanding this moment required listening more than responding. He continued, his voice gaining strength. "I want to establish a foundation at the Institute for families who can't afford treatment. Not for tax breaks or social recognition, but because every parent should have access to what Sophia received. I'd like to use part of my portfolio, but I'd also like to learn from your approach to wealth. How to have it without letting it define you." The request surprised me, not in its generosity, which crisis had apparently awakened, but in its humility. Marcus was asking to learn something beyond spreadsheets and strategies. He wanted to understand values he had previously dismissed as outdated or irrelevant. "We can start with small steps," I suggested. "Anonymous donations, living below your means, measuring success by impact rather than income." He nodded, taking mental notes with the same intensity he once reserved for profit margins. As Sophia's treatment concluded with remarkable success, our family gathered for a celebration dinner at a modest restaurant she had chosen, not the upscale establishments Marcus usually preferred. Watching her laugh at Elena's stories while Marcus and Victoria listened without checking phones, I felt Howard's absence keenly but also his presence in the values finally taking root in our fractured family. The money had indeed revealed character, but crisis had also built it, forcing each of us to confront who we were versus who we wanted to be. That night, after everyone had gone home, I found a message from Elena on my phone. It was a photo from dinner, catching a moment when Sophia had made Marcus laugh genuinely, his usual calculated expression replaced by authentic joy. The accompanying text read simply, "Thank you for keeping the faith in us, even when we didn't deserve it." I saved the photo, adding it to the collection I'd maintained through 8 years of distance and dysfunction, proof that families could heal even after deep wounds. 6 months after Sophia's accident, the changes in our family had solidified into new patterns. Marcus and Victoria had downsized their home, using the equity to fund the foundation they'd established. Preston and Parker, initially resistant, had discovered they actually enjoyed having parents present at dinner rather than always working or networking. Marcus still worked hard but had learned to differentiate between productivity and presence, showing up for family gatherings with his phone turned off, a change so dramatic that Elena initially thought he was ill. The revelation about my financial situation had spread to extended family and friends, creating its own ripples. Some relatives who had pitied the poor widow suddenly became attentive, while others who had genuinely cared seemed hurt by the deception. I navigated these reactions with patience, understanding that my choices had consequences beyond my immediate family. The friends who remained were those who understood that privacy wasn't betrayal and that testing character, while painful, sometimes revealed necessary truths. Sophia returned to school with minimal deficits, her recovery so complete that new teachers wouldn't have known about her injury without being told. But she carried wisdom beyond her years, often observing family dynamics with an insight that surprised us all. One evening, as I taught her to tend the small garden I'd started on my condo's balcony, she said, "Grandma, the accident was scary, but it made our family real. Before, everyone was acting. Now, we're just being." Her words captured something I'd struggled to articulate. The performance of success that had defined Marcus and Victoria's life had given way to authentic engagement. The careful distance maintained to protect reputations had dissolved into genuine closeness. Even my own carefully constructed fiction of poverty had ended, replaced by honest discussions about wealth, values, and the responsibilities that came with both. We were, as Sophia observed, finally being rather than performing. A year after the accident, I made another significant decision. Rather than continue living alone in my condo, I purchased a large farmhouse outside the city, with enough room for the entire family to gather comfortably. It wasn't ostentatious. Marcus's initial instinct to help me upgrade to something impressive was gently redirected, but it was warm and welcoming, with spaces designed for different needs. A library for Sophia's voracious reading, a workshop where Marcus was learning woodworking from YouTube videos, discovering satisfaction in creating rather than acquiring. A music room where Preston and Parker were teaching themselves guitar, free from the pressure of perfection. A commercial kitchen where Elena and I cooked together, preparing meals that brought everyone to the table. Victoria initially struggled with the farmhouse's distance from urban amenities, but she discovered an unexpected passion for gardening, finding peace in soil and growth that her corporate life had never provided. She and I spent hours planning and planting, our relationship evolving from formal politeness to genuine friendship. She confessed one afternoon, while transplanting tomatoes, that Sophia's accident had saved their marriage, forcing her and Marcus to confront what they were building together versus what they were achieving separately. The financial revelations had also prompted difficult conversations about inheritance and legacy. Marcus and Elena worked with estate planners to ensure that wealth would be distributed not just fairly but thoughtfully, with trusts designed to provide opportunity without removing incentive. Education would be funded, but luxury wouldn't be subsidized. Business ventures could be supported, but only those with social benefit components. The goal was to pass on resources without passing on the entitlement or disconnection that wealth could breed. During one family dinner at the farmhouse, Marcus raised a toast that surprised everyone. "To secrets revealed and lessons learned," he said, looking directly at me. "To Mom, who loved us enough to let us fail and patient enough to watch us grow. And to Sophia, whose strength reminded us what really matters." The clink of glasses felt like punctuation to a long, difficult sentence that had finally found its conclusion. Later that evening, as the family dispersed to various activities, Sophia found me on the porch watching the sunset. She curled beside me on the swing Howard had built 40 years earlier, one of the few pieces I'd brought from our old home. "Grandma," she said thoughtfully, "do you think people can really change, or do they just become more themselves?" I considered her question, thinking about Marcus's journey from dismissive to engaged, Victoria's evolution from rigid to flexible, Elena's growth from resentful to understanding, and my own progression from secretive to open. "I think," I said slowly, "that crisis reveals who we really are beneath who we're pretending to be. Sometimes that revelation shows us someone better than we expected, sometimes worse. But once we see clearly, we have a choice to stay revealed or to truly change. Your accident revealed all of us, sweetheart. What we did with that revelation, that's where the real story lies." She nodded, satisfied with this answer, and we swung gently as the sun set over the gardens that were just beginning to bloom. The story could have ended there, with reconciliation and growth, a family reunited by crisis and reformed by truth. But life rarely provides such neat conclusions, and the real test of change comes not in moments of crisis but in the ordinary days that follow. 2 years after Sophia's accident, when the urgency of her recovery had faded into routine wellness checks and the family dinners had become regular rather than remarkable, that's when the true measure of our transformation would be taken. It started with a phone call on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday morning. I was transplanting seedlings in the greenhouse I'd added to the farmhouse, my hands deep in soil, when Elena called with barely contained excitement. Her school district had received a massive grant to develop an innovative special education program, and she'd been selected to lead it. The opportunity was everything she'd worked toward, recognition for her dedication and expertise rather than her connections or credentials. But there was a catch. The program required her to relocate to Seattle, 3,000 miles from the family that had just learned how to be together. The old Marcus would have seen Elena's opportunity as a chance to reclaim his position as the successful sibling, the one whose achievements mattered most. The old Victoria would have calculated the social capital of having a sister-in-law running a nationally recognized education program. The old me might have felt abandoned, watching the child who had always been there for me choose career over proximity. But we weren't those people anymore, or at least we were trying not to be. The question was whether our changes would hold when tested by distance and success that wasn't born from crisis. I told Elena to take the position without hesitation, though my heart contracted at the thought of losing our weekly cooking sessions and her weekend visits with Sophia. This was her moment to shine professionally, and I wouldn't let my need for her presence dim that light. She cried on the phone, not from sadness but from relief that I understood, that I wouldn't make her choose between opportunity and obligation. We spent an hour discussing logistics, how to maintain connection across distance, how to ensure Sophia wouldn't feel abandoned by another important figure in her life. When I shared Elena's news at that Sunday's family dinner, the reactions were telling. Sophia immediately asked if she could visit Seattle during summer break, excited about exploring a new city with her favorite aunt. Preston and Parker, now teenagers who had developed their own relationships with Elena through her patient tutoring, offered to help her pack and research neighborhoods. Victoria pulled out her laptop to look up Seattle's cultural offerings, genuinely interested rather than performatively engaged. And Marcus, in perhaps the most significant response, raised his glass in a toast to Elena's success without a single mention of his own achievements or any comparison between their careers. But later, as I helped clear dishes, Marcus pulled me aside with an expression I recognized from his childhood, the look he got when wrestling with feelings too complex for his young vocabulary. "Mom," he said quietly, "are we losing her because we weren't good enough to her when it mattered?" The vulnerability in his question, the acknowledgement of past failures and fear of consequences, showed more growth than any grand gesture could have demonstrated. "We're not losing her," I assured him, though I understood his fear. Distance doesn't erase growth or undo healing. Elena knows we're different now, that we're a real family. This move is about her dreams, not our failures. He nodded, but I could see the work he was doing to believe it, to not interpret every departure as judgment on his past behavior. It was work we all had to do, choosing to see opportunities rather than abandonments, growth rather than punishment. Elena's departure date approached with bittersweet anticipation. We organized a going-away party that reflected our new dynamics, held at the farmhouse rather than Marcus's country club, with Elena's teacher friends mixing comfortable with Victoria's law colleagues. The gifts we gave her were thoughtful rather than expensive, things she would actually use in Seattle rather than displays of wealth. Marcus created a digital photo album of family moments from the past 2 years, proof that we had become the family she'd always deserved. Victoria compiled a cookbook of all the recipes we'd perfected during our communal dinners. Sophia painted a picture of the garden, capturing in watercolor what words couldn't quite express about roots and growth and distance. My gift was more complex, a decision I'd been contemplating since Elena announced her move. I established an education foundation in Howard's name with Elena as the primary advisor, funded with $200,000 from my portfolio. It would provide grants to teachers pursuing innovative special education approaches, giving Elena a way to multiply her impact beyond her single program. When I presented the documentation at her party, she broke down completely, understanding that this wasn't charity or compensation for past neglect, but recognition of her value and amplification of her voice. The night before Elena left, she stayed at the farmhouse, and we sat up late in the kitchen that had become our sanctuary. She told me things she'd held back for years, resentments about Marcus's favoritism despite his failures, anger at Howard and me for enabling his entitlement, frustration at being the good child whose goodness was expected rather than celebrated. I listened without defending or explaining, understanding that she needed to voice these truths before she could fully release them. When she finished, exhausted from emotional excavation, I shared my own truth about the weight of managing family dynamics, the exhaustion of loving people through their worst selves, the fear that I had enabled Marcus's weaknesses by trying to protect him from consequences. We weren't seeking forgiveness from each other because there was nothing to forgive between us. Instead, we were acknowledging the complex reality of family, where love and frustration intertwined so tightly that separating them would destroy both. Elena's departure wasn't escape but evolution, taking the lessons of our dysfunction and recovery to create something better elsewhere. As dawn approached and we finally headed to bed, she hugged me with the fierce intensity of a daughter who had chosen to love despite disappointment, the strongest kind of love there is. The drive to the airport included the entire family, Preston and Parker having insisted on missing school to say goodbye properly. The boys had developed their own relationship with Elena over the past 2 years, discovering in their aunt someone who saw them as individuals rather than extensions of their parents' ambitions. She had taught them that success could be measured in impact rather than income, that teaching special needs children required more intelligence than managing hedge funds. They were considering careers in education and social work, choices that would have horrified the old Marcus but which he now discussed with genuine interest. At the departure gate, the goodbyes were emotional but not desperate. We had learned the difference between physical proximity and emotional presence. Elena would be 3,000 miles away, but she would also be more present through video calls and intentional connection than she had been during years of obligatory holiday visits. Sophia gave her the journal she'd been keeping during recovery, asking Elena to add her own stories and send it back, creating a transcontinental narrative between them. Marcus handed her a business card for his company's Seattle office, not as networking but as reassurance that she would have local support if needed. Victoria promised to visit during her firm's next Seattle case, this time for dinner rather than deposition. When Elena hugged me last, she whispered, "Thank you for showing me that families can change, that people can grow. Thank you for not giving up on any of us, even when we gave you every reason to." I held her tightly, memorizing the feeling for the lonely moments I knew would come, then released her to pursue the life she'd earned through dedication and sacrifice. Watching her walk toward her gate, confident and accomplished, I felt Howard's presence strongly, his pride in the daughter-in-law who had chosen service over status and found success in both. The drive home was quieter, each of us processing Elena's absence differently. Sophia asked if we could set up a weekly video dinner where Elena could join us virtually, an idea that Marcus immediately supported with plans for technology that would make it feel natural. Victoria suggested we take turns visiting Elena monthly, creating regular connection while exploring a new city. The collaborative response to maintaining family bonds despite distance showed how far we'd traveled from the isolation of false success. Back at the farmhouse, the empty chair at dinner that night was acknowledged rather than ignored. We talked about Elena openly, sharing memories and anticipating her future successes. Marcus admitted he'd been researching special education programs to better understand Elena's work, not for networking but for genuine interest. Victoria had connected Elena with a Seattle colleague who could help navigate the city's legal resources for families with special needs children. Even Preston and Parker had joined online forums about education innovation, wanting to understand their aunt's passion. 3 weeks into Elena's absence, an unexpected crisis tested our new dynamics differently than medical emergency had. Marcus's company faced a hostile takeover attempt that threatened not just his position but the jobs of hundreds of employees. The old Marcus would have handled this alone, viewing it as a professional challenge requiring ruthless strategy. But the evolved Marcus called a family meeting, laying out the situation with vulnerability I'd never seen in his professional life. He wasn't seeking solutions, he had those, but support, understanding that some battles shouldn't be fought in isolation. The response was remarkable. Victoria offered her legal expertise pro bono, her firm's resources valuable in fighting corporate raiders. I provided not money but perspective, sharing stories of Howard's business struggles that Marcus had been too young or too distant to remember, humanizing the fear and uncertainty he was experiencing. Sophia, with the wisdom that near-death experiences can bring to children, simply sat beside her father and held his hand, offering presence without words. Even Elena, from Seattle, joined our strategy sessions via video, her questions about employee impact keeping Marcus focused on human rather than purely financial considerations. The battle took 2 months, during which our family rallied in ways that would have been impossible before Sophia's accident. We attended board meetings as a unified front, presenting not just financial arguments but human ones. Preston and Parker researched corporate social responsibility, finding precedents that supported their father's position. Victoria worked 18-hour days preparing legal briefs while still maintaining her garden, finding balance in soil and statutes. I used connections from my principal days, rallying community support that proved corporations were more than stock prices. When Marcus ultimately prevailed, keeping his position and protecting employee jobs though at considerable personal financial cost, the victory felt collective rather than individual. He had chosen people over profit, accepting a lower buyout to ensure severance packages for workers who might have been terminated. The decision cost him nearly $1 million in potential profit, money the old Marcus would never have sacrificed for strangers. But the new Marcus understood that some victories were measured in maintained livelihoods rather than multiplied portfolios. At the celebration dinner following the successful defense, Marcus made an announcement that surprised everyone. He was restructuring his role, reducing his hours to spend more time with family and pursue the foundation work he'd started after Sophia's recovery. The salary reduction would be significant, but he and Victoria had been living below their means for 2 years now, finding contentment in connection rather than consumption. Preston and Parker, rather than being disappointed by their father's step back from corporate climbing, seemed relieved and proud, understanding that he was choosing presence over prestige. Victoria matched his announcement with her own. She was leaving Big Law to start a family practice focused on special needs advocacy, inspired by both Sophia's journey and Elena's work. The prestige and pay would be fractions of her current position, but the purpose would be exponentially greater. She looked at me as she explained her decision, seeking not approval but understanding, which I gave through tears of pride. The woman who had once viewed my modest appearance as embarrassing was choosing meaningful over monetary, impact over income. These professional pivots might have created financial anxiety, but the truth was that my revealed wealth had liberated them from the endless accumulation that had defined their previous lives. Knowing there was a safety net, though one I made clear would only catch catastrophic falls rather than comfortable stumbles, allowed them to take risks with purpose rather than profit. The money that had once been hidden as a test of character now served as a foundation for character already proven. 6 months after Elena's departure, she called with news that brought our transformed family full circle. She had met someone, a fellow educator named David, who shared her passion for innovative teaching and saw her dedication as strength rather than sacrifice. She was nervous about introducing him to us, worried that our family's complex history might overwhelm an outsider. But when David joined our video dinner the following week, he fit naturally into our dynamic, laughing at inside jokes he didn't fully understand and contributing his own stories of family dysfunction and recovery. The wedding, planned for the following summer at the farmhouse, became a project that unified us in joy rather than crisis. Marcus handled logistics with the same intensity he'd once reserved for mergers, but now focused on meaningful rather than impressive. Victoria managed legal documents while teaching Sophia calligraphy for the invitations. Preston and Parker learned woodworking from YouTube tutorials to build an arbor for the ceremony. I grew flowers specifically for Elena's bouquet, each bloom chosen for meaning rather than appearance. The wedding day itself was a testament to transformation. Elena walked down an aisle lined not with expensive flowers but with photos of her students, the children whose lives she'd changed through patient dedication. Marcus's speech as maid of honor, a role reversal that would have been unthinkable years earlier, brought the entire gathering to tears as he spoke about learning success from his younger sister's example. Victoria sang, her voice untrained but sincere, a song about roots and wings that captured our family's journey. Sophia served as flower girl with a gravity that honored her second chance at life, each petal scattered with intention. David's family, normal in ways we had forgotten how to be, initially seemed overwhelmed by our intensity and history. But as the evening progressed, they recognized in us something universal, a family that had nearly lost itself to false values and fought to recover true ones. David's mother pulled me aside during the reception, thanking me for raising Elena with the values that had attracted her son. I accepted the compliment while knowing that Elena had maintained those values despite us rather than because of us, her integrity a compass that had pointed true even when surrounded by magnetic dysfunction. The moment that crystallized our transformation came during the father-daughter dance traditionally reserved for biological fathers. Elena had asked Marcus to share the dance with her, acknowledging that while he hadn't been the brother she'd needed growing up, he had become the brother she'd wanted him to be. Watching them dance, Marcus crying openly while Elena whispered something that made him laugh through his tears, I saw the full scope of our journey. We had traveled from performance to presence, from accumulation to connection, from success to significance. Howard would have loved this version of our family. Not perfect, we still carried scars from years of misplaced priorities and would occasionally revert to old patterns under stress. But we were conscious now, aware of our tendencies and actively choosing better. The money that had once divided us through its absence and presence had become simply a tool, powerful but not defining. Relationships had become our true wealth, measured not in frequency of contact but in depth of connection. As the reception continued into the night, I found myself standing apart momentarily, observing the celebration from the farmhouse porch. Sophia found me there, as she always seemed to when I needed grounding. She was 13 now, taller than me and carrying herself with a confidence earned through survival. She would start high school in the fall, her recovery so complete that new friends wouldn't know her history unless she chose to share it. The accident that had threatened everything had ultimately given us everything that mattered. Grandma, she said, leaning against the porch railing beside me, do you think we would have become this family without my accident? Do you think Dad would have changed, Mom would have softened, Elena would have felt valued, without crisis forcing us to see clearly? It was a profound question from someone who had paid the highest price for our family's transformation. I considered carefully before answering, owing her honesty after all she'd endured. I don't know, sweetheart. I want to believe we would have found our way eventually, but sometimes people need earthquakes to realize they're building on sand. Your accident was our earthquake. But what we built after, that was choice, not chance. We could have returned to our old patterns once you recovered. Instead, we chose to become who we're supposed to be rather than who we thought we should be. She nodded, satisfied with this framing that gave her suffering meaning without making it necessary. Inside, the party continued with the easy joy of people who had earned their happiness through honest struggle. David and Elena swayed together, lost in their private world while surrounded by family. Marcus and Victoria danced with their sons, the four of them laughing at Preston's attempts to teach his parents current moves. Family friends mixed with Elena's teacher colleagues and David's relatives, creating a tapestry of connection that wealth alone could never have purchased. Near midnight, as the reception wound down, Marcus approached me with an envelope. Inside was a check for $300,000, the amount I'd paid for Sophia's treatment. I don't want this, I said immediately, trying to return it. That money was given freely, without expectation of return. He refused to take it back, his expression serious in the soft light of paper lanterns. It's not repayment, Mom. It's investment. Elena and I have been discussing expanding the Howard Foundation you created. This adds my contribution, not to erase debt but to multiply impact. We want to create something that outlasts all of us, that helps families navigate medical crisis without choosing between treatment and survival. Consider it my tuition for the lessons you taught me about real worth. The check was still in my hand, but its meaning had transformed from transaction to transformation, from payback to pay forward. The next morning, as we cleaned up from the wedding, our family worked together with the easy rhythm of people who knew their roles without assignment. Preston and Parker folded chairs while discussing their college applications, both now interested in schools known for social impact rather than social prestige. Victoria and David washed dishes while debating education policy, finding common ground in their different approaches to helping children. Marcus and Elena walked the property, planning where to build a small education center that would host workshops for families with special needs children. Sophia and I tended the garden, pulling weeds and planting new seeds, the eternal cycle of growth and renewal. That afternoon, before Elena and David left for their honeymoon, we held one last family meeting in the library that had become our unofficial heart of the house. Elena presented her vision for the expanded foundation, including scholarships, family support services, and research funding. Marcus outlined the business structure that would ensure sustainability beyond our lifetimes. Victoria detailed the legal framework that would protect the mission while allowing evolution. Even Preston and Parker contributed, suggesting a youth advisory board that would keep the foundation responsive to changing needs. As I listened to my family plan a legacy of service rather than success, I felt a profound completion. The money I had hidden for 8 years had indeed revealed character, but not in the way I'd expected. It hadn't exposed greed I needed to avoid but potential I needed to nurture. The test had become a teaching tool, the secret had become a story, the wealth had become wisdom. We had transformed transaction into transformation, using financial capital to build social capital that would outlast any bank account. Elena and David's departure for their honeymoon marked not an ending but an evolution. Our family had learned to be together while apart, to support without suffocating, to love without conditions or calculations. The weekly video dinners continued, now including David and eventually the children that would follow. The foundation grew, helping hundreds of families navigate crisis without choosing between health and home. The farmhouse became a gathering place for those learning that success meant significance, that wealth meant well-being, that family meant showing up rather than showing off. 3 years later, when Preston left for college, choosing social work over investment banking to his parents' pride rather than disappointment, I knew our transformation was complete. Not perfect, perfection was neither possible nor desirable, but genuine. We had learned to measure worth in presence rather than presence, in time rather than timeline, in depth rather than display. The boy who had once been groomed for Harvard Business School was heading to a state school with an excellent social program, and Marcus couldn't have been prouder. Parker would follow a year later, pursuing environmental science with the same passion Carl had shown, though none of us ever said that aloud. The parallel was both painful and beautiful, a reminder that influence outlives presence, that values transcend death. Sophia had developed her own interests in medicine, specifically neurology, inspired by the doctors who had saved her but determined to make such salvation accessible to all. She would be the first to attend an Ivy League school, but chosen for its research opportunities rather than its reputation. The empty nest that followed might have created crisis for Marcus and Victoria, their identity as parents shifting as children launched. But they had learned to be partners beyond parenting, individuals beyond achievement. Marcus's foundation work had become consuming in the best way, requiring travel to understand needs and creativity to address them. Victoria's practice had grown to include 3 other attorneys, all committed to advocacy over affluence. They sold the Westchester house without regret, moving to a smaller place near the farmhouse, choosing proximity to family over proximity to power. On what would have been Howard's 80th birthday, our entire family gathered at the farmhouse for a celebration of his legacy. Elena flew in from Seattle with David and their infant daughter, named Hope, a choice that made me cry when they'd announced it 9 months earlier. Preston and Parker returned from college with stories of internships and impact. Sophia, now in her first year of pre-med, brought her study group, young people who saw medicine as mission rather than money. Marcus and Victoria arrived with foundation board members who had become friends rather than merely colleagues. As we sat around the massive dinner table, 3 generations connected by choice rather than mere chance, I thought about the journey from that hospital waiting room where Marcus had dismissed me as too broke to help. The money had mattered, but not in the way anyone expected. It hadn't bought health or happiness directly. Instead, it had bought time for healing, space for growth, opportunity for impact. Most importantly, it had revealed that worth wasn't in wealth but in willingness to show up, to struggle, to transform. Elena raised a toast that captured our collective journey. To Grandma Margaret, who loved us through our worst and believed in our best. To Grandpa Howard, whose wisdom structured support beyond his lifetime. To Sophia, whose strength showed us what survival really means. To Marcus and Victoria, who proved people can change when they choose growth over ego. To Preston and Parker, who are building on foundations we finally got right. And to all of us, for learning that family isn't about blood or money but about showing up when it matters and staying when it's hard. The clinking of glasses echoed through the farmhouse, a sound that would have meant something different in our old lives, about celebration of achievement rather than connection. Now it meant we had survived our success and thrived through our failures. We had learned that breaking could lead to building, that secrets could lead to revelation, that judgment could transform into justice tempered by mercy. The money remained, carefully managed and purposefully deployed, but it no longer defined us. We had found something rarer than wealth, we had found our way back to each other. As the evening progressed into night, with multiple generations mixing naturally, I stepped outside for a moment of solitude. The stars were brilliant above the farmhouse, unmarred by city lights we'd once thought essential. I thought about the call I'd make to Richard the next morning, discussing new investment strategies not for accumulation but for impact. The foundation needed an endowment that would outlast us all, ensuring that families in crisis would find support rather than judgment, resources rather than abandonment. Sophia found me there, as she always did, carrying hope, who had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's calm demeanor. The baby reached for me with the trust that only comes before the world teaches caution. As I held my great-granddaughter, Sophia said something that summarized our entire journey with profound simplicity. "We're rich, Grandma. Not the kind Dad used to want to be, but the kind that actually matters. We're rich in the right ways now." She was right. We had transformed currency into care, assets into action, portfolios into purpose. The $800,000 that had once seemed like everything and nothing simultaneously had become simply a tool in service of something greater. It had taken a crisis to reveal character, but it had taken choice to build it. We had chosen, again and again, in small moments and large decisions, to be the family we were meant to be rather than the one we performed for so long. Looking through the window at my family, genuine in their joy and generous in their love, I knew Howard would be proud. Not of the money, which had been merely mechanism, but of the meaning we'd found through losing and finding each other. The test had ended, but the teaching continued. Each day brought opportunities to choose connection over accumulation, presence over presence, depth over display. We didn't always choose correctly, old patterns died hard, but we chose consciously, and that made all the difference. The night ended with exhausted children sleeping wherever they'd landed, adults continuing conversations that ranged from profound to silly, and a sense of contentment that no amount of money could purchase but that money, properly understood, could protect and enable. As I prepared for bed in the room I'd shared with Howard, now filled with photos of the family we'd built and rebuilt, I felt his presence one last time, approving and amused by the long path we'd taken to obvious truths. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena, already back in Seattle but unable to sleep. "Thank you for believing we could become this," it read. "Thank you for the patience and pain it took to get here. Thank you for showing us that broke has nothing to do with money and everything to do with connection." I saved the message, adding it to the collection of evidence that transformation was possible, that families could heal, that love properly tested could emerge stronger and truer. The next morning brought ordinary glory, breakfast with too many people for our kitchen, arguments about coffee strength, debates about political issues that would have divided us before but now simply seasoned conversation. Marcus helped Preston with graduate school applications, his advice focused on purpose rather than prestige. Victoria taught Parker how to read legal documents, preparing him for advocacy regardless of his career choice. Elena and David planned their next visit, scheduling around Sophia's medical school interviews. The foundation board meeting that afternoon would approve 3 new family grants, each one a story of crisis transformed into opportunity. As I watched my family navigate the beautiful chaos of connection, I realized the ultimate irony of our journey. The money I'd hidden to test character had indeed revealed it, but not as deficiency to avoid. Rather, it had revealed potential to develop, strength to build, love to nurture. The broke my son had accused me of being had been true, but not financially. We had all been broke in ways that mattered more than money, broken in our ability to connect authentically, to value properly, to love unconditionally. The $800,000 hadn't fixed that brokenness, but it had funded the time and space to heal it. The story that had begun with mockery and dismissal, with a son too blinded by conventional success to see his mother's worth, had transformed into something neither of us could have predicted. Marcus hadn't just apologized for his assumption about my finances, he had revolutionized his entire understanding of value. Victoria hadn't just accepted my wealth, she had redefined her own. Elena hadn't just forgiven our neglect, she had shown us how to serve. Sophia hadn't just survived her accident, she had become our teacher in resilience. Preston and Parker hadn't just accepted their parents' changes, they had built upon them. And I hadn't just revealed my financial truth, I had discovered a deeper one. The test I had created to measure my children's character had ultimately measured my own. Did I have the courage to maintain boundaries while keeping love? Could I watch my children struggle without rescuing them prematurely? Would I choose truth over comfort, revelation over reputation? The answer to all these questions had been harder than any financial decision I'd ever made. But in finding those answers, in living through the consequences of both secret and revelation, I had discovered that wealth properly understood wasn't about accumulation but about amplification of what truly mattered. The foundation we built together, both literal and metaphorical, would outlast us all. Not because of the money that funded it, though that mattered, but because of the values that informed it. Every family we helped would receive not just financial support but the knowledge that crisis could catalyze growth, that breaking could lead to building, that the lowest moments could become turning points if met with courage and care. We had lived that truth, earned that wisdom through pain and patience, and now we could share it with others walking similar paths. Years from now, when I'm gone and my great-grandchildren ask about the family fortune, they won't be told about hidden money and dramatic reveals. Instead, they'll hear about transformation and choice, about the courage to change and the harder courage to forgive. They'll learn that wealth is worthless without wisdom, that success means nothing without significance, that family is built through showing up rather than showing off. The $800,000 will be a footnote in a story about something much more valuable, the discovery that being broke has nothing to do with money and everything to do with being broken from what matters most. 5 years had passed since Elena's wedding, and the farmhouse had become something of a landmark in our community, not for its architecture but for what it represented. Families facing medical crises would arrive at our door, referred by the foundation, seeking not just financial assistance but proof that survival was possible. I would serve them tea in mismatched cups that Victoria had once found embarrassing, and we would share our story, the real one, without the polish that distance and time might have added. These conversations always began with money but ended with meaning, with visitors understanding that resources were just tools for rebuilding what crisis had broken. It was during one such visit that everything changed again. A couple sat across from me in the living room, their teenage son between them, his head bandaged from recent surgery. They were drowning in medical debt, but more than that, they were drowning in the divide that crisis had created between them. The father blamed the mother for not having better insurance, the mother blamed the father for the accident that had caused the injury, and their son sat silent between them, bearing both his physical wounds and the weight of his parents' disintegration. As I shared our journey, focusing on how Sophia's accident had initially divided us before ultimately uniting us, I noticed Marcus standing in the doorway. He had arrived early for our monthly foundation meeting, but instead of interrupting, he listened. When I reached the part about him dismissing me as too broke to help, he stepped forward, addressing the family directly. "That was me," he said quietly. I was so focused on conventional success that I couldn't see real worth. It took nearly losing my daughter and completely losing my way to understand that broke had nothing to do with bank accounts. The father looked up at Marcus, recognizing something in his expression, the shared experience of letting pride obscure priority. "What changed?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and barely suppressed emotion. Marcus sat down beside them, abandoning his usual professional distance. "I had to lose everything I thought mattered to find what actually did. My mother's wealth could have saved us financially, but it was her wisdom that saved us as a family. The money just gave us time to figure that out." That afternoon, as the family left with not just a check but a roadmap for rebuilding, Marcus lingered in the kitchen where I was washing those mismatched cups. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying weight I'd learned to recognize, "Victoria and I have been talking. We want to do more than just run foundation meetings and write checks. We want to create a retreat center here at the farmhouse, a place where families can come to heal together, not just receive financial support." The proposal wasn't entirely surprising. I had watched Marcus and Victoria transform their professional skills toward service, but this was a leap beyond philanthropy into something more personal. It would mean opening our home regularly to strangers, sharing not just resources but space, creating structured programs for healing that went beyond our informal conversations. It would mean surrendering the privacy we had finally found after years of public scrutiny and family drama. Yet looking at Marcus's expression, seeing the purpose that had replaced his previous ambition, I knew this was the natural evolution of our journey. We spent the next 6 months converting the farmhouse into something unprecedented, a healing space that wasn't clinical like a hospital or artificial like a hotel, but genuinely homely, maintaining the lived-in warmth that made vulnerability feel safe. The barn became a meeting space for group sessions, its rustic beams unchanged but now supporting both physical structure and emotional rebuilding. Guest rooms were prepared not with luxury but with comfort in mind, spaces where families could stay during intensive weekends focused on reconnecting through crisis. Victoria surprised everyone by getting certified in family counseling, adding therapeutic expertise to her legal knowledge. She approached the training with the same intensity she'd once applied to billing hours, but now the measurement was in breakthrough moments rather than billable minutes. Watching her facilitate her first family session, gentle but direct, using her own journey from rigid success to flexible significance as a bridge for others, I saw the woman she was always meant to be finally fully emerged. Elena flew in from Seattle to help design the program curriculum, bringing her expertise in special education to create materials accessible to families with varying needs and capabilities. She and David had welcomed a second child by then, a boy named Howard Marcus, the middle name a reconciliation gesture that had made Marcus cry when they'd announced it. Elena's presence during the retreat center's development reminded us that distance hadn't diminished our connection, that the family we'd rebuilt could stretch without breaking. Sophia, now in her final year of medical school, contributed her own perspective, creating material specifically for young people navigating family crisis. Her personal story of recovery, both physical and familial, became central to the program. She had a gift for reaching teenagers who felt responsible for their family's struggles, showing them that healing wasn't their burden to carry alone but their opportunity to participate in. Watching her work with young people, combining medical knowledge with lived experience, I saw Carl's spirit living on through his sister's service. The retreat center's opening weekend brought 3 families, each facing different medical crises but sharing the common experience of relationships strained to breaking point by circumstances beyond their control. As I watched Marcus facilitate a session on financial planning during crisis, his advice practical but his demeanor humble, I remembered the man who had once viewed wealth as worth. The transformation was complete but ongoing, each family he helped adding another layer to his understanding of value. That first evening, as the 3 families sat around our massive dining table, sharing stories and food with the cautious hope of people who had found unexpected community, Preston called from his graduate program. He was working on his thesis about social support systems during medical crisis, using our foundation's data to demonstrate that financial assistance without emotional support had limited impact. His professors were impressed, but more importantly, Preston was proud, not of potential accolades but of contributing to understanding that could help other families navigate their darkest moments. Parker joined the call from his environmental science program, where he was developing sustainable agriculture programs that could provide both food security and therapeutic gardening opportunities for families in crisis. The brothers, once groomed for conventional success, were building careers around contribution, measuring achievement in impact rather than income. Their parents beamed with pride that had nothing to do with prestige and everything to do with purpose. As months passed, the retreat center evolved from experiment to institution. Families would arrive broken and leave not healed. Healing was a longer journey, but hopeful, equipped with tools and supported by community. We kept statistics for grant purposes, tracking financial assistance distributed and therapeutic sessions provided, but the real measures of success were harder to quantify. Marriages saved from the strain of medical bankruptcy, siblings reconnected after crisis-driven separation, parents who learned to see their children's strength rather than their limitations, these were the returns on investment that mattered. One particularly challenging weekend brought a family whose dynamics eerily mirrored our own from years before. Successful parents, a sick child, grandparents dismissed as irrelevant, and money becoming the focus instead of the tool. The father, a technology executive, reminded me so forcefully of the old Marcus that I had to excuse myself momentarily, overwhelmed by the parallel. When I returned, Marcus was sitting with the man, sharing his own story with a vulnerability that would have been impossible for him before his transformation. I watched my parents sacrifice everything for my education and success, Marcus told the man, and I repaid them with dismissal and distance. I thought their modest lifestyle meant they had nothing to offer, that success was measured in portfolios rather than presents. It took my daughter nearly dying and my mother revealing she could have bought and sold me several times over to understand that I had everything backwards. The technology executive listened with the skepticism of someone who still believed conventional success was the only kind that mattered, but I saw the first cracks in his armor, the beginning of questions that might lead to transformation. His wife, meanwhile, sat with Victoria in the garden, learning that partnership during crisis required surrendering the need to control outcomes. Victoria shared how she and Marcus had nearly divorced during the worst of their image-obsessed years, how Sophia's accident had forced them to choose between their marriage and their masks. "The fact that you're here together," Victoria said gently, "means you've already chosen each other over your separate suffering. Now you need to learn how to suffer together productively rather than destructively." Their son, 16 and angry at the world that had given him cancer and parents too busy achieving to notice his decline until it was almost too late, found unexpected connection with Sophia, who was visiting for the weekend. She didn't minimize his anger or offer empty platitudes about everything happening for a reason. Instead, she shared her own fury at the unfairness of her accident, at losing her brother, at parents who had finally shown up only when she was unconscious. But she also shared how that anger had eventually transformed into fuel for purpose, how surviving had given her a responsibility to help others do the same. By Sunday afternoon, when the families prepared to leave, the technology executive pulled me aside. "Your son mentioned you have an investment portfolio," he began, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much money it would take to make Marcus respect me the way he clearly respected me now. I interrupted gently but firmly, explaining that the amount was irrelevant, that Marcus's transformation hadn't come from discovering my wealth but from discovering his own poverty of priorities. The man struggled with this concept, so entrenched in measuring worth through wealth that alternative valuation seemed impossible. His wife joined us, having overheard the conversation, and surprised us both by saying, "He's trying to figure out if you're rich enough for your opinion to matter. It's what he does with everyone." The honesty was brutal but necessary, the kind of truth that crisis sometimes forces into the open. The man didn't deny it, couldn't deny it, and in that moment of acknowledged truth, real change became possible. Before they left, their son approached me privately, pressing a folded paper into my hand. It was a poem about feeling invisible in a family focused on visible success, about being a broken thing in a house of perfect facades. But the last line held hope, mentioned finding people who saw cracks as places where light entered rather than flaws to be hidden. I kept that poem, adding it to the collection of evidence that our story was both unique and universal, that families everywhere struggled with the same confusion between worth and wealth, success and significance. 6 months into running the retreat center, we faced our first major crisis. A family had left seemingly stabilized, grateful for the financial support and therapeutic intervention, only to call weeks later from the depths of despair. The father had attempted suicide, unable to reconcile his identity as a provider with his new reality as someone who needed provision. The mother was barely holding together, their children confused and frightened, and everything we thought we'd helped build had collapsed. Marcus and I drove through the night to reach them, finding a family shattered in ways our program hadn't anticipated or addressed. As Marcus sat with the father in his hospital room, man to man, provider to provider, discussing the crushing weight of perceived failure, I realized our program had a crucial gap. We had focused on rebuilding families but hadn't adequately addressed rebuilding individual identity when crisis stripped away everything that had previously defined someone. This failure haunted Marcus particularly. He had been that man, finding worth only in provision, meaning only in achievement. If Sophia's accident had permanently disabled her, if he had been unable to work, would he have survived the identity crisis? The question wasn't hypothetical but practical, forcing us to reconfront our own journey and recognize how much chance had played a role alongside choice. We had been lucky in ways this family hadn't, and our program needed to account for those who faced not just financial and family crisis but existential ones as well. The program evolution that followed was painful but necessary. We brought in specialists in trauma and identity, people who understood that sometimes the greatest casualty of medical crisis wasn't health or wealth but self. Victoria developed new legal frameworks for protecting families when a primary earner became unable to work, ensuring dignity alongside assistance. Elena created educational materials about redefining success when traditional measures became impossible. I spent hours with spouses of injured providers, sharing not just my story of hidden wealth but the deeper story of learning to see worth beyond provision. Preston and Parker, home for winter break, contributed their own perspective as children who had watched their father transform from provider to present, from successful to significant. They created a peer support program for young adults whose parents were navigating identity crisis alongside medical ones. The honesty required was brutal, acknowledging that they had initially resented their father's step-back career, had been embarrassed by their family's downsized lifestyle, before eventually understanding that Marcus choosing meaning over money had given them permission to do the same. The father who had attempted suicide slowly recovered, not just physically but existentially. Months of therapy, both individual and familial, helped him understand that his worth wasn't in what he provided but in who he was, a father who loved his children, a husband who had stood by his wife, a man whose value couldn't be measured in dollars. Watching his journey, darker and more difficult than ours had been, reminded us that transformation wasn't a destination but a continuous choice, one that some days required more strength than anyone should have to summon. His family became regular volunteers at the retreat center once they stabilized, their story adding crucial depth to our program. They represented the families for whom our initial journey would have seemed like privilege, those who faced not just financial strain but complete financial ruin, not just identity questions but identity crisis so severe it threatened survival itself. Their presence kept us honest, preventing our story from becoming sanitized or our program from assuming resources we had been fortunate to have. A year into the retreat center's operation, a documentary filmmaker contacted us about featuring our story. Initially, we declined, the years of privacy too precious to surrender for public consumption. But Elena, participating in the discussion via video call, made a compelling argument. Our story could help families we'd never meet, could demonstrate that transformation was possible even when relationships seemed irreparably broken. After long deliberation, we agreed, but with conditions. The focus would be on the families currently in our program rather than our historical journey, and any proceeds would go directly to the foundation. The filming process was invasive but illuminating, forcing us to articulate lessons we'd learned intuitively. Marcus, being interviewed about his transformation, struggled to explain the moment he'd recognized his mother's worth beyond wealth. It wasn't just finding out about the money, he finally said. It was realizing she'd watched me dismiss her for years and loved me anyway. That kind of love, that patient, persistent love that believes in someone's capacity to change even when they show no signs of it, that's wealth no bank can hold. Victoria, filmed while facilitating a family session, demonstrated the power of professional skills redirected toward purpose. Her legal precision, once used to maximize billable hours, now helped families navigate the complex landscape of medical debt and insurance appeals. But more than her expertise, it was her vulnerability that reached people, her willingness to say, "I was you," valuing appearance over authenticity, and I almost lost everything that mattered because of it. The families trusted her not despite her history but because of it. Sophia's segments were the most powerful, this young woman who had every reason to be bitter, speaking about gratitude. Not gratitude for her accident, she was clear about that, but gratitude for what it had revealed and built. My family was performing before my injury, she explained to the camera. Everyone playing roles, nobody really present. The accident broke the performance. We had to become real because reality was all we had left. I wouldn't choose brain injury for anyone, but I can't deny that it gave me a real family where I'd only had a successful one before. The documentary's release brought unexpected attention. Families from across the country began reaching out, some seeking financial assistance, others just seeking hope that their crisis might become catalyst rather than catastrophe. We couldn't help everyone, our resources were substantial but not infinite, but we could share our story, the real one, including the mistakes and failures and ongoing struggles. The film became a tool in our program, showing families that transformation wasn't a smooth journey but a series of choices, some successful, some not, but all moving towards something better than before. Among the contacts was a call that stunned us all. Jesse's mother, Diane, Gregory's first wife whom none of us had heard from in over 15 years, had seen the documentary. She was facing her own crisis, a cancer diagnosis with a grim prognosis, and she was alone, her second family having dissolved years earlier. She wasn't seeking money, she was clear about that, but connection, a chance to know the grandchildren she'd abandoned when she'd left Gregory for what she'd thought would be a better life. The request created a family crisis of a different kind. Marcus's immediate response was rejection, the wounds from his mother leaving when he was 12 still raw despite decades of scar tissue. Victoria was more pragmatic, worried about the impact on Preston and Parker, who had no memory of their biological grandmother. Elena, ever the voice of compassion, suggested that denying someone connection during their final months was cruel regardless of past actions. But it was Sophia who provided the deciding perspective. She left and hurt people, Sophia said during our family meeting about Diane's request. But so did Dad, and we forgave him. So did Mom, and we forgave her. If our family's message is that people can change, that crisis can create transformation, don't we have to at least see if that's true for her too? The wisdom from someone so young, who had suffered so much and chosen forgiveness anyway, shamed us into agreement. Diane's visit was scheduled for a neutral weekend, not during a retreat when other families would be present, but not during a holiday that would create pressure for false intimacy. When she arrived, I was struck by how much she'd aged, how different she looked from the confident woman who had walked away from her family seeking something better. She was nervous, clearly prepared for rejection, carrying a small box that she clutched like a lifeline. The initial meeting was awkward, everyone unsure of their roles in this unexpected scene. Marcus maintained careful distance while Preston and Parker observed with curious detachment this stranger who shared their DNA. But Diane surprised us all by not trying to minimize her abandonment or excuse it with circumstances. She had left because she'd wanted more than suburban motherhood, had chosen herself over her children, and had spent 15 years learning that the life she'd thought she wanted was emptier than the one she'd left. The box she carried contained letters, one for each birthday and Christmas she'd missed, never sent because she hadn't known where to send them or whether they'd be welcome. They weren't excuses but acknowledgments, each one documenting her growing understanding of what she'd thrown away. Marcus read his silently, his expression cycling through emotions I couldn't interpret. When he finished, he looked at his former mother with something that wasn't quite forgiveness but was no longer pure anger. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, the honesty that our family had learned through crisis serving him now. "I don't know how to have a mother who chose to leave and another mother who chose to stay," gesturing to me. "I don't know how to introduce you to my children or explain your absence and presence. But I know how to try, because this family has taught me that trying is sometimes all we can do. The effort counts even when the outcome is uncertain." Over the following months, Diane became a careful addition to our extended family ecosystem. Not a grandmother in the traditional sense, but a presence the boys learned to call Diane, someone whose story served as a cautionary tale about choices and consequences. She volunteered at the retreat center, her own abandonment giving her credibility with parents who were considering leaving because staying felt too hard. Her message was consistent, that leaving didn't lead to freedom but to a different kind of prison, one built from regret rather than responsibility. Her cancer progressed despite treatment, and as she weakened, something unexpected happened. Marcus began visiting her regularly, not from obligation but from a genuine desire to understand. Their conversations, which he sometimes shared with me, were archaeological excavations of family history, uncovering patterns and wounds that had shaped generations. Diane's father had been absent, her mother overwhelmed, and she had sworn to be different only to repeat the pattern when reality proved harder than intention. "This doesn't excuse what I did," she told Marcus during what would be one of their last conversations. "But maybe understanding it helps prevent repetition. You chose differently when things got hard. You stayed, you changed, you built something better. That's the chain breaking. That's the healing happening." Marcus held her hand as she spoke, this woman who had been his mother for 12 years and a stranger for 15, finding in her story another thread in the tapestry of transformation our family had woven. When Diane passed, the funeral was small but significant. Marcus delivered a eulogy that spoke not about the mother who had left but about the woman who had returned, seeking not absolution but connection. He talked about the courage it took to face the children you'd abandoned, to admit failure without excuse, to use your story as a warning for others considering similar choices. Preston and Parker served as pallbearers, honoring a grandmother they'd barely known but whose late-life honesty had added depth to their understanding of family. The retreat center continued to evolve, shaped by each family's story, each crisis that revealed new ways relationships could break and potentially rebuild. We added programs for families dealing with addiction, recognizing that medical crisis often revealed or created substance dependencies that complicated recovery. We developed resources for single parents navigating crisis alone, understanding that not every family had the option of reconciliation. We created support groups for siblings of sick children, acknowledging Sophia's insight that family crisis affected everyone, not just the identified patient. 5 years became 7, then 10. The farmhouse, once our private sanctuary, had become a semi-public space where healing happened regularly if not easily. The documentary had led to a book, which I had written reluctantly but honestly, sharing not just our success but our struggles, the ongoing work of maintaining transformation rather than reverting to old patterns. The royalties funded expansion of our programs, allowing us to serve families who couldn't travel to the farmhouse through virtual sessions and regional partnerships. Marcus's foundation work had become his full-time focus, his business acumen redirected towards sustainable growth of charitable impact. He traveled frequently, not for deals but for understanding, visiting families in their own contexts to better grasp the variety of ways crisis manifested and might be addressed. Victoria had built her practice into a national model for legal advocacy during medical crisis, training other attorneys in the combination of legal expertise and human compassion that made justice feel like care rather than combat. Elena's work in Seattle had garnered national recognition, her programs being replicated in districts across the country. She and David had added another child to their family, a daughter named Carol Margaret, my namesake, who carried forward the hope that each generation might do better than the last. Their visits to the farmhouse were celebrations of distance overcome, proof that family could stretch without breaking if the connections were maintained intentionally. Sophia had completed her residency and joined a practice focused on neurological rehabilitation, her personal experience informing her medical expertise in ways that made her uniquely effective with families navigating similar traumas. She had married a fellow physician who understood that her scars, both physical and emotional, were sources of strength rather than weakness. Their wedding at the farmhouse had been a reunion of families who'd gone through our programs, a celebration of survival and transformation that honored struggle while embracing joy. Preston had become a social worker specializing in family crisis intervention, his thesis having evolved into a book about the intersection of financial and emotional support during medical trauma. Parker had developed urban farming programs that provided both food security and therapeutic activity for families dealing with long-term medical challenges. Neither had pursued the conventional success their parents had once envisioned, and Marcus and Victoria couldn't have been prouder of their choices to prioritize purpose over prestige. The money that had started this entire journey, the $800,000 that Marcus had mocked as impossible for his broke mother to possess, had multiplied through careful investment and generous donation into something far more valuable than its numerical worth. It had funded hundreds of families through crisis, supported the development of programs now considered national models, and most importantly, had taught us all that wealth meant nothing without wisdom to deploy it meaningfully. Yet for all our success in helping others, we faced our own ongoing challenges. The work was exhausting, secondary trauma real, and the weight of other families' pain sometimes overwhelming. We instituted mandatory breaks, forcing ourselves to rest and restore, recognizing that burnout served no one. We entered family therapy ourselves, not from crisis but from wisdom, understanding that maintaining healthy dynamics required ongoing attention and adjustment. There were setbacks and failures, families we couldn't help, marriages that didn't survive despite our best efforts, children whose medical outcomes were tragic regardless of financial or emotional support. Each loss hit us personally, reminding us that transformation wasn't guaranteed, that sometimes crisis simply remained crisis without redemptive arc. These failures kept us humble, prevented our story from becoming mythology rather than history, forced us to acknowledge the role of fortune in our own journey. On the 15th anniversary of Sophia's accident, we held a celebration that was really a reckoning. All the families who had come through our programs were invited back, creating a gathering of hundreds who had faced the worst and were still standing. As I looked across the crowd, seeing Marcus teaching financial planning to a group of young fathers, Victoria leading a legal rights workshop, Sophia counseling teenagers about recovery, Elena coordinating children's activities, Preston and Parker running support groups for young adults, I saw the full multiplication of what had started with one family's near destruction. The evening's program included testimonials from families whose stories had become intertwined with ours. Each one added a thread to the tapestry, showing how individual transformation could become collective healing when properly supported and shared. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus stood to address the gathering, holding the same checkbook he'd once used to calculate his net worth, now using it to demonstrate different calculations entirely. 15 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the crowd, I thought my mother was too broke to help when my daughter needed life-saving treatment. I measured worth in dollars, value in portfolios, success in accumulation. That assumption, that terrible miscalculation of what constituted wealth, could have cost us everything. Instead, it taught us everything. His voice caught slightly as he continued. My mother's revelation of her financial resources was shocking, but her demonstration of her emotional resources was transformative. She showed us that broke has nothing to do with money and everything to do with broken connections, broken priorities, broken understanding of what matters. He paused, looking directly at me before continuing. This gathering, these hundreds of families who have found healing in crisis, this is what wealth looks like. Not the $800,000 that started it, but the millions of moments of connection, support, and transformation that money enabled. The calculations that matter aren't in portfolios but in people helped, relationships healed, futures restored. We were all broke in some way when crisis hit. The miracle isn't that we had money to address it but that we found meaning through it. 20 years after that hospital waiting room where Marcus dismissed me as too broke to help, I stood in the same building, now renamed the Wilson Family Medical Center after our foundation's largest donation. Marcus stood beside me, gray-haired now, watching his grandson play with Sophia's children in the pediatric ward's new healing garden. The boy looked up at his grandfather with the same eyes Marcus once had, but these eyes saw worth beyond wealth. You were never broke, Grandma Margaret, he said suddenly, wisdom beyond his 8 years. You were the richest one all along. You just let everyone learn that for themselves. Marcus squeezed my shoulder, understanding finally complete. The money had merely been the catalyst. The real fortune was in the family we'd broken and rebuilt, stronger for having been tested. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.